Nobody thinks they're the villain.
Not the guard who humiliated prisoners for sport, not the soldier who followed orders into atrocity, not the executive who signed off on decisions that destroyed thousands of lives, not the neighbor who looked the other way while terrible things happened next door. Every single one of them had a story, a self-narrative in which they were the reasonable one, the obedient one, the loyal one, the practical one, the one doing what anyone in their position would have done. This is the most disturbing truth in all of psychology. Not that evil people exist. That part is easy to accept. The disturbing truth is that evil is not primarily done by evil people. It is primarily done by ordinary people, people with families, with friends, with genuine kindness in their daily lives, placed in specific situations that activate specific psychological mechanisms that every human brain possesses, including yours, including mine. The psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who spent decades studying the psychology of evil after conducting one of the most famous and disturbing experiments in the history of social science, called this the Lucifer effect, the transformation of good people into perpetrators of evil through the power of situation. Not through the power of character, through the power of situation. Understanding how this happens is not a morbid intellectual exercise. It is the most important thing you can know about human nature, because the only protection against these mechanisms is knowing they exist in yourself, operating below your conscious awareness, waiting for the right conditions to activate. By the end of this video, you will understand the 4 psychological pathways through which ordinary people commit terrible acts, backed by landmark research that shook the foundations of what we believed about human goodness. This is not comfortable content, but it is necessary content. Let's get into it. The banality of evil. Ordinary faces, extraordinary horror. In 1961, philosopher Hannah Arendt attended the war crimes trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, responsible for the logistics of transporting millions of people to their deaths. She went expecting to encounter a monster, a man visibly different from ordinary humanity. Someone whose face or manner or bearing would explain, at least partially, how such a person could exist. What she found instead disturbed her far more profoundly than a monster would have. Eichmann was ordinary, bureaucratic. He spoke in clichés. He was concerned with procedure, with efficiency, with following the chain of command correctly. He was not consumed by hatred. He was not psychologically aberrant in any detectable way. He was, in Arendt's precise and chilling phrase, terrifyingly normal. She coined a term for what she observed, the banality of evil, the idea that the most extreme evil in human history was not produced primarily by sadists, psychopaths, or ideological fanatics, though these existed at the fringes. It was produced primarily by ordinary people doing ordinary things, following orders, performing administrative functions, staying loyal to their institutions, without engaging the moral reasoning that would have told them what those ordinary things were producing. This observation, controversial when Arendt first made it, increasingly validated by decades of subsequent research, is the foundation of everything that follows. Evil, at scale, does not require evil people. It requires ordinary people inside systems and situations that disable, bypass, or gradually erode their moral reasoning while providing alternative frameworks. Duty, loyalty, efficiency, us versus them, that make terrible acts feel not just acceptable but required. The question is not whether you are capable of this. The research says you are. The question is which specific mechanisms produce this transformation and how they can be recognized and resisted. Pathway 1. Obedience to authority. The Milgram revelation. In 1961, the same year Arendt was watching Eichmann's trial, a psychologist at Yale University named Stanley Milgram was designing an experiment that would produce what many consider the most disturbing finding in the history of social psychology. Milgram wanted to understand obedience. Specifically, he wanted to understand how ordinary Americans would respond to instructions from an authority figure to harm another person. The experiment he designed was elegant and devastating in equal measure. Participants were recruited through newspaper advertisements and told they were participating in a study on memory and learning. Upon arriving at the lab, each participant was assigned the role of teacher, while a confederate, an actor working with the research team, was assigned the role of learner. The learner was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room and connected to what appeared to be an electrical shock device. The teacher and the actual participant sat in front of a shock generator with switches ranging from 15 volts labeled slight shock all the way to 450 volts labeled simply XXX. The teacher was instructed to ask the learner questions and administer an electric shock every time the learner gave a wrong answer, increasing the voltage with each mistake. As the voltage levels escalated, the learner, following a script, began expressing increasing distress, grunting at 75 volts, demanding to be released at 150 volts, screaming at 270 volts, falling silent, ominously, completely silent, beyond 330 volts. When participants expressed reluctance or wanted to stop, the experimenter, dressed in a grey lab coat projecting calm authority, used a series of standardized prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. The shocks were not real. The learner was an actor. The distress was performed, but the participants did not know this. From their perspective, they were potentially injuring or killing a real person. And Milgram's question was simple. At what point would they refuse? Before running the experiment, Milgram surveyed psychiatrists about their predictions. The consensus was that approximately 1% of participants, only the most disturbed, the most pathological, would administer the maximum shock. Normal people, the experts agreed, would refuse long before that point. The actual result destroyed this consensus completely. 65% of participants administered the maximum 450-volt shock, not 1%, 65%. Ordinary Americans, teachers, postal workers, engineers, salesmen, continued shocking what they believed was a screaming, then silent human being in the next room because a person in a grey lab coat told them the experiment required it. The finding was not that 65% of Americans were secretly psychopathic. The finding was that the situation, the presence of legitimate-seeming authority, the incremental escalation of the request, the diffusion of responsibility onto the authority figure, the social pressure of the experimental context, was powerful enough to override the moral convictions of the substantial majority of ordinary people. Milgram's conclusion was stark and has never been effectively refuted. The behavior of his participants was largely determined not by their character but by the situation they were placed in. Change the situation and the behavior changed dramatically. When the experimenter gave instructions by phone rather than in person, compliance dropped to 21%. When two experimenters disagreed in front of the participant, virtually nobody continued. The situation was doing most of the moral work. Character was doing far less than anyone wanted to believe. Pathway 2. The costume becomes the identity. The Stanford Prison Experiment. If Milgram showed what obedience to authority could do in a controlled laboratory setting, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment showed something even more deeply unsettling: how rapidly a person's entire moral identity could be replaced by the identity of a role they had arbitrarily been assigned to play. In 1971, Zimbardo converted the basement of Stanford University's psychology building into a mock prison. He recruited 24 male college students, screened for psychological normality, randomly assigned to roles of prisoner or guard, and told them to play their roles for 2 weeks. The guards were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses to prevent eye contact with prisoners, and told they were responsible for maintaining order. The prisoners were given prison uniforms, assigned numbers instead of names, and subjected to realistic arrest procedures. Zimbardo planned a 2-week study. He ended it after 6 days. Within 36 hours, the guards had begun to abuse their power in ways that shocked even the researchers. They created arbitrary rules, enforced them with psychological humiliation, forced prisoners to perform degrading tasks, restricted bathroom access, and systematically stripped the prisoners of their individuality and dignity. Some guards became sadistic with remarkable speed, inventing new cruelties seemingly for their own entertainment, becoming progressively more aggressive the longer the experiment continued. The prisoners, meanwhile, rapidly showed signs of genuine psychological breakdown. Within 36 hours, one prisoner had to be released due to extreme emotional disturbance. Others became passive, depression-like, submissive, demonstrating in real time the psychological effects of dehumanization and powerlessness. They stopped thinking of themselves as college students playing a role. They began to experience themselves as prisoners. Most disturbing of all was Zimbardo's own behavior. As the experiment's superintendent, he became so absorbed in his role as prison authority that he initially resisted calls to shut the experiment down, not seeing the suffering occurring in front of him because he was inside the situation rather than observing it from outside. It took an outside observer, a colleague who visited the prison on day 5 and was horrified by what she saw, to force him to recognize what the experiment had become. The lesson Zimbardo drew was not that the guards were bad people who had been hiding their sadism. They had been selected for psychological normality. The lesson was that the costume had become the identity, the role had replaced the person. When a situational context provides a social identity, guard, prisoner, superior, subordinate, and that identity is powerful enough and immersive enough, people abandon their individual moral framework and adopt the moral framework of the role. De-individuation, the psychological process of losing individual identity within a role or group, is one of the most powerful pathways from ordinary behavior to extraordinary cruelty. You stop asking, what would I as myself do here? You start asking, what does someone in my position do here? And the answers to those two questions can be horrifyingly different. Pathway 3. Gradual escalation, the moral frog in boiling water. Neither Milgram's participants nor Zimbardo's guards woke up on the first day of their respective experiments intending to harm anyone. The transformation to harmful behavior did not happen in one dramatic moment of choice. It happened through gradual escalation, a sequence of small steps, each one only marginally more extreme than the previous, that collectively traversed an enormous moral distance while allowing the individual to maintain the subjective sense that they had never made a single, genuinely bad choice. This is one of the most important and most underappreciated mechanisms in the psychology of evil. People do not generally make one large decision to cross a major moral threshold. They make a series of small decisions that each feel like minor extensions of what they've already agreed to, until they look up and find themselves somewhere they would never have agreed to go had they been shown the final destination at the beginning. Psychologists call this the foot in the door technique when it is applied as a persuasion method. When it occurs in the context of moral escalation, it is sometimes described as a slippery slope, though that term undersells the mechanism's power and precision. It is not slippery, it is engineered. The gradual escalation of Milgram's shock levels, 15 volts to 30 to 45, each step barely distinguishable from the previous, was specifically designed to exploit this mechanism. By the time participants reached 300 volts, they had already administered 20 shocks. Stopping now would mean acknowledging that the previous 20 were wrong. Cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs, pushed them to continue rather than confront the implication of stopping. The same mechanism operates in real-world contexts with chilling consistency. Soldiers who commit atrocities in war rarely begin by committing atrocities. They begin with small dehumanizing acts, language, small indignities, that are progressively normalized until more extreme acts feel like natural extensions of an established pattern. Corporate fraud rarely begins with large-scale deception. It begins with small accounting adjustments that rationalize themselves as minor, then as normal, then as necessary, until the minor adjustments have compounded into something catastrophically different. The protection against gradual escalation is prospective moral redlining, explicitly defining in advance and in calm conditions the specific boundaries you will not cross, regardless of the incremental pressure to cross them. Not in the heat of the situation, where each step feels small and justified, before the situation when you can see the full distance between where you are and where the escalation could take you. Pathway 4. Dehumanization, the permission slip for cruelty. The final pathway is perhaps the most ancient and the most consistently present across the full range of human atrocity throughout history. Dehumanization and the psychological process of stripping a person or group of their perceived humanity is the mechanism that removes the most fundamental barrier to harming other people. Your brain has a powerful built-in inhibition against causing suffering to beings it perceives as fully human. This inhibition is not just moral, it is neurological. Brain imaging studies show that perceiving another person's pain activates mirror neuron networks and empathy-associated regions in the observer's brain. You literally feel a shadow of another person's suffering when you witness it. This neurological empathy response functions as a biological brake on cruelty. It makes hurting people feel bad at a level below conscious reasoning. Dehumanization bypasses this brake. When a person or group is consistently portrayed, through language, imagery, propaganda, or social norm, as less than fully human, the neurological empathy response to their suffering is measurably reduced. They become vermin, cockroaches, enemies, animals, terms that have been used to describe target groups in every major genocide and mass atrocity in human history, not coincidentally but deliberately. The language of dehumanization is the preparatory step for mass violence because it disables the biological system that would otherwise make mass violence psychologically impossible for ordinary people to participate in. Dehumanization does not require large-scale propaganda campaigns to operate. It operates in ordinary social contexts through subtler mechanisms: outgroup othering, social exclusion, the assignment of negative essential characteristics to groups different from your own. Every time a group of people is reduced to a stereotype, a label, or a set of characteristics that denies their full individual humanity, the dehumanization mechanism is being activated to some degree. The scale differs enormously. The mechanism is the same. The protection against dehumanization is the deliberate, active practice of individuation, the conscious effort to see the individual human complexity behind any group label, including groups toward which you feel hostility or fear. Not as a feel-good exercise, but as a neurological recalibration, reactivating the empathy response that dehumanizing frames have suppressed. If this is making you think about yourself differently right now, good, that's the point. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments, which of these 4 pathways do you think is the most dangerous in today's world? What this means for how you live. The most important implication of everything in this video is not about history or extreme situations. It is about right now, about the ordinary situations in your daily life where these same mechanisms operate at lower intensities. The authority figure, whose instructions you follow without questioning, the gradual escalation of small compromises in your ethics, the outgroup your social environment encourages you to see as less than fully human the role you inhabit so completely that you stop asking what you as an individual actually believe. Knowing these mechanisms exist does not make you immune to them. Zimbardo himself, one of the world's leading experts on situational evil, was not immune. What knowledge does is create the possibility of noticing, of pausing, of asking the question that cuts through every one of these mechanisms with equal effectiveness. Is what I am doing right now something I would be comfortable defending to a person I deeply respect, with full transparency about every detail of the situation? Not to the authority figure giving you instructions, not to the group whose norms you are conforming to, not to the role you are playing, to a person whose moral judgment you genuinely trust with nothing hidden. If the answer is no, or even if you feel a strong reluctance to even imagine the question like all of that discomfort is information. It is your moral reasoning, fighting to be heard above the situational noise. Listen to it. Hannah Arendt's most important contribution was not the concept of the banality of evil, it was the implication that follows from it. If evil is situational rather than dispositional, if it is produced by systems and situations rather than by fundamentally different people, then the prevention of evil is not about identifying and removing bad people. It is about understanding and resisting the situations and systems that transform ordinary people. That work begins with exactly what you just did in this video, looking clearly, without flinching, at the mechanisms inside yourself, not to feel guilty, not to conclude that humanity is hopeless, but to know your own mind well enough that when the situation tries to use it against your values, you have the awareness and the courage to notice what is happening. Nobody thinks they're the villain. The people who manage not to become one are the ones who stay awake to the possibility that they could. Like this video if this made you think about something you've never quite examined before. Subscribe, because next week we are going deep on the psychology of why people believe things that are obviously false, and the specific cognitive mechanisms that make smart people just as vulnerable as anyone else. That one is going to be deeply uncomfortable in the best possible way. Let's go.